first heard about hidden Armenians when I was little, and it was more like a rumor of people saying, and I can't really remember the details, I was little. There were people saying in the community, I think I overheard it after church one Sunday, from another photographer in Buenos Aires, Martin Keskisian, his name, probably Keshishian, changed to Keskisian anyway. And he was saying, or he wrote an article saying that these other photographer, Shiraz, had found Armenian villages in Sasun. This being, the pre-internet era, it was a different world. It was, the Soviet Union existed. Turkey was a completely taboo place for Armenians, diaspora Armenians. Nobody dared to go or even think about going there. We knew there were Armenians in Constantinople, in Molis, but other than that, we thought that most other Armenians had either been exterminated or Turkified already. But there was this rumor. And then when I was 16 years old, there was an Argentine-Armenian journalist called Narciso Binayan Carmona, a man of encyclopedic knowledge, who loved Romania, by the way. Narciso was almost pathological hoarder of books. He had probably one of the largest private libraries in Argentina, of about 40,000 volumes at home. And he was friends with my father, not very close, but they were friends. And by the time I was 16, since I was very little, I knew I wanted to be a journalist. And he had agreed. He worked for an important newspaper in Buenos Aires, La Nación. It's a broadsheet, traditional newspaper. He had agreed to, from time to time to receive me, discuss international affairs. And very often when I would drop by to visit him at his apartment, I would be made to wait in his library, in one of the many rooms that were his extensive library. And I would love to, that's something I love to do. I pick books randomly and I open them randomly and see what comes up in the pages. So I picked up a little volume called Le Musulman Oubli. So that's in French, The Forgotten Muslims. It was a curious title, so I picked it up and I opened it into a page, I think it was page 60 or something, 62, I don't remember. Anyway, and one name caught my attention. It said Hamshen Uhemshin. This book was about the Muslims of the Soviet Union. We're talking 1984, the Soviet Union existed. As you probably know, at the time, the Soviet Union was associated with Russia. So everybody thought of Soviet Union, okay, they're all Russians, or different Russians, some with bigger noses and dark hair, but they're all more or less Russians. And whereas, everybody knew that it's multi-ethnic, everybody who knew something about Soviet Union knew that it's a multi-ethnic country. So anyway, I was wondering why there would be a Muslim population in the Soviet Union that was called Hamshen or Hemshin, which sounded to me Arabic. I don't speak Arabic, but my mother does. I was born in Syria, but I was very little when my family moved to Argentina. I never learned Arabic. But I knew the name or something that sounded like it, which is Hamsin, which in Arabic I think means 50. And it's also the name of a wind, a Sahara wind, Hamsin. And the surprise was even bigger when I read It was just a graph or two, a paragraph or two that said Muslim Armenians who speak an archaic dialect of Armenian, who live in Abkhazia and Georgia, and some have been deported by Stalin to Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan or both of them. And I was completely taken aback. It was the first time I read about Muslim Armenians. And I remember that evening asking my father, did you know about these people, the Hamshenses? I didn't know anything about them. And he very vaguely told me, oh yeah, my son, they are Turkified Armenians. I met a Hamshensi, as it happens, filmmaker called Özcan Alper in New York at the Lincoln Center. He was presenting his movie Sonbahar. In the Q&A session, I had a difficult question for him about the genocide. And this is 2009, 2 years after Hrant Dink's assassination. But he was very brave, being a Turkish citizen in a hall where there were other Turks. He used the word genocide, which is something I appreciate, which was per se a recognition by a Turkish citizen of a historical fact denied by his own state. So I asked him, how come the Hamshenses, being of Armenian descent and speaking a dialect of Armenian, had been spared the massacres during the genocide? And I was surprised by his answer. So he basically told me that they had escaped the genocide because they lived in a very remote place. They were pretty much harmless. They had been Muslim for about 2 centuries by then, and they were considered assimilated. And then I approached him afterwards, and I told him that he was very brave. He told me something in Hamshetsnak, of which I only understood one word, Ahpar, brother. And I was very touched by that, and I remembered the promise, or the thing I had told my father, the promise I had made myself maybe, that I'm going to write a book about them, and that's how I did. So I went there, especially after learning that it was, after all, it wasn't a myth, that there were hidden Armenians, as Hrant Dink was saying. He said that there were 2 million Armenians. He probably knew what he was talking about. He was one of them, actually. He was an Armenian from Malatya, so he knew what he was talking about. He probably had a basis for claiming that, but I don't. I wanted to see Armenian life in the historical provinces where the genocide happened. I did find that. It does still exist. But it's different than what I thought. I did 2 major trips. The first one was very brief. It was an introduction to what I was going to do. An exploratory trip in 2011. 45 days, and I was there in 2013 and 14, traveling more extensively, staying longer in areas I wanted to explore more, like Sasun, the Kranagert, which the Kurds and the Turks call Diyarbakir. I organized it into 10 regions in the book. It's more or less an arbitrary decision. So I basically took the 6 vilayets, or the 6 traditional Armenian provinces of what used to be the Ottoman Empire, and plus Giligia, Cilicia, and Hamshen. And I added some Asia Minor communities that fell outside the confines of what was Western Armenia, like Kastamonu, Amasya, Gümüşhacıköy, which are in the Black Sea. And the reason for that is that there were still pockets of Armenians living there. I organized it like that because that was the material I had. For example, I went to some places where I couldn't find or speak with any Armenians. The Malatya Armenians, in their emails, nominally, were welcoming me, and while I was waiting for them there, they never turned up. So I finally, it took me a few days to realize that it was a polite way of saying thanks but no thanks, and they had probably good reasons. Malatya has a terrible reputation in terms of aggressions against Christians, some young Turkish nationalists. I think they were grey wolves, Bozkurtlar. They had decapitated a priest, an Italian priest, I believe, in 2006, 7, something like that. So it's a place where you have to be really careful about your Armenian roots. I had met a Malatya girl who had found out her entire family was of Armenian origin by the age she was 16, after that decapitation of this Italian or this Christian missionary or priest in Malatya, because they got police protection outside their home, and she was wondering, why are we getting police protection? And her family had to tell her, well, we're Armenian. And she only found out by chance after she was 16 or 17. She didn't even know. Her family had kept it from her until then. I think every story that went into the book has its own merit. They come from survivors, they come from their descendants, but they also come, and this is interesting, from the descendants of perpetrators. I was in Hamshen with a friend I had made there, a Hamshensi. I'm not going to give his name, but let me call him, I'll give him a Turkish name. They all have Turkish names, but I'll call him Emre. Among the Hamshensis, you also find political currents that you find in Turkish society at large. So there are Hamshensis who are left, and when I say left, they are really hardcore left, hardcore Marxist-Leninists, like really hardcore ideologically, anti-religious, and they partly explain it, like most people in that part of the world, Armenia or the Middle East generally, they try to make you comfortable, and they would tell me the reason we are leftists is that because we know that we've been forcibly converted to Islam, so it's kind of a pushback against that. Emre was leftist, and you always found him drinking and playing cards with his friends or arguing over a Tavli Nardi game, backgammon. So one day with his friends, we went to camping site. So we sat in the bed of a pickup truck, Emre and I, and the region of Hamshen, the Pontic region, is tends to be very cloudy. It's very rainy, and there are lots of jokes about that. And the weather is variable. It's like Florida. You know what about Florida? They say if you don't like the weather in Florida, give it 5 minutes. So you know it can be sunny, and then it becomes dark. It looks like apocalyptic, and then you know there is a downpour. So when we sat in the back of the truck, it was sunny. As the truck was going, it became cloudy. And there is something, I don't know if it happens to everybody, but you know, sometimes the weather affects our mood too. And as it began to, you know, as it was becoming cloudy, as the clouds were gathering, our mood, my mood and Emre's too, became gloomy. And I don't know why we started talking about childhood memories. And by the time I had been for a long time in Hamshen, among the Hamshensis, I was part of the local crowd. They would meet with them every day, and I already spoke their dialect. And he told me this story about his grandfather and his grandfather's friend gathering the children. For some reason in my memory, I have this, it was either they sat before the stove in winter, where they were making chai when they were making tea, or before the fireplace, and they were telling stories to Emre and his little friends. And Emre had, you know, big Armenian eyes, and he said they would tell them when they were little how Emre's grandfather and his friend pushed Armenians to their deaths in the genocide from a place called Cehennem Deresi, which would be the devil's abyss. And he was telling me this in his beautiful Western Armenian dialect of Hamshetsnak. In Hamsheneren we were talking. It was the two sides of the Armenian nation. Myself, the grandchild of genocide survivors, and himself, the grandchild of Armenian converted to Islam and perpetrators. And it still, you know, it still gives me shivers down my spine, because I remember Emre's face and his big eyes. When he told the story, he opened his eyes wide and he said we would listen to them in awe. And I was trying to imagine, how does a story like that impact you? As my grandmother's stories did. My grandmother was not a sentimental person, I have to say. And I'm not saying this to pretend that we Armenians are civilized or look how nice we are. She passed away in 1999 when I was 31. In the 3 decades I knew her, only once I heard her I don't remember over what, say one curse against the Turks. She, a genocide survivor, who remembered her little sister dying in the desert, who remembered her mom passing out and passing away in the desert, and being so numb because of starvation that she didn't feel anything over her own mother's death. For some reason, I only remember that she had somehow found in the garbage orange peels, and she would eat that. I remember she was thirsty. That's a constant among genocide survivors. They were all thirsty. They will tell you that. And she remembered when they arrived in Aleppo and lost track of her brother, and they didn't find each other until 1972. From 1915 until 1972. With her brother publishing every now and then in Armenian newspapers, as people did at the time, I'm looking for my sister, and he persevered, and he has kept a diary of the genocide. She remembers when they arrived in Aleppo, outside the Armenian church of the 40 martyrs, Karasulmangans, where I was baptized. There were every day piles of Armenians who were dying or had died, and a priest would come to give them their last extreme unction and bless them, and they would be taken away in carts. She remembered that scene. I remember that scene of her description of these piles of Armenian bodies every day. And she never said a bad thing about the Turks. She was not sentimental. And the same way she was telling me these stories, around the same time, Emre's grandfather was telling that. And he was a leftist, he was pro-Armenian, he was one of the quote-unquote good Hamshensis who supported the Armenians, who supported the genocide recognition. But I remember that story, under the black clouds of the Black Sea. Common theme is the struggle to come to terms with who you are in a hostile, inimical environment like Turkey. Turkey is not the country that tourists go and see. Even some of these characters I met, my interviewees, when the red light of the camera was blinking that I was recording, they would say, "Oh no, Turkey is changing, we're now brothers," and things like that. And I remember it was in Sassoon, I believe, when I switched it off. Never trust them, they would tell me. And I relished when the Turkish nationalists had found out that he was of Armenian origin because of his DNA test. And I would see his face grimacing and trying to come to terms, and oh my God, how come this tragedy happened to me? Why? And I was very happy, and he was trying to find, you know, some redemption in that. And he was asking me, but is there any gene? He asked me this: is there any gene in the Armenian DNA that shows that they are good warriors or something like that? And I said no. He was like, you know, feeling very miserable. Some others were embracing their identity, but it's always a struggle, because you live in that environment. There are lots of kids who revere Ataturk, Armenian kids, or love the Turkish flag, or want to become Turkish policemen or Turkish soldiers. And I was horrified. And I was saying, but there are surely better professions than being a Turkish soldier for an Armenian kid in Turkey. And they were surprised, no, I dream about serving my homeland. And they were perfect Armenians. And I remember this conversation in Sasun with this little kid, so well-mannered, so well-behaved, so educated. And he wanted to become a Turkish soldier. And discussing this with a Kurdish friend in Dikranagert, she told me, you know, why is that? Why so many? Because she had been a teacher, and she remembered Kurdish kids at the time of the Turkish repression of the Kurds, in the bad years, you know, the lead years, as they say, of the 80s and 90s. There were lots of Kurdish kids who wanted to become Turkish policemen and soldiers. And she was surprised. Why? Why do you want to serve the enemy? It wasn't that. In the same way that kids born into families where some beloved member is sick want to become doctors to cure her, they wanted to become soldiers and policemen to protect their families. Instinctively they felt that. And they were right. If you have uniform, you can protect your family. So there are lots of rumors that the PKK, the Kurdish insurgency, is full of Armenians or hidden Armenians. And the nationalists and the Kurdish Islamists, or the pro-Turkish Kurds, because those exist too, we don't know about those, but they do exist, and in big numbers. They call them sünnetsizler, which in Turkish means the uncircumcised. That means the non-Muslims. That means the Armenians. But anyway, I found very few former PKK militants who were Armenian. I spoke with one of them. He was a totally committed PKK militant, Marxist-Leninist in his discourse. It kind of, you know, his views on Armenians and Armenian demands really didn't match mine as an Armenian. He was all for the Brotherhood of Nations, building a democratic Kurdistan. I told him, you know, these are Armenian lands. Oh, no, but that's something we can discuss later. I don't know about that. I want a democratic Kurdistan where everybody, you know, can have brotherly relations with all peoples, it's going to be multi-ethnic. So he wasn't very much into, let me call it Armenian patriotism, or if you want nationalism, I don't have a problem with that. I love my homeland, I love my country, I love my people. He wasn't too much into that. He was more, you know, a PKK militant who believed in the dogma and the ideology. But he told me, and of course, the genocide was one of the reasons that drove me to join the PKK. And I told that to Apo. Apo is Abdullah Öcalan, where I met him. I told him I'm Armenian, and part of the reason why I'm joining the PKK is for justice for my ancestors. He remembered when he was little, every Friday in their little village, people after Friday prayers at the mosque would come to stone their house. These converted Armenians who were nominally Muslims, who were Muslims anyway, who didn't speak a word of Armenian, who just remembered they were of Armenian origin, and they were very scared about that because they were born Armenian. And they would come to stone the house every Friday. Now imagine you're a little kid, you're 6 years old. Imagine you're any age. You have neighborhood comes to stone your house because you were born something. And that's when he became sad. It's from a genocide survivor, Kirkor Olgasyan, in the village of Argat in Harpert, which the Turkish occupation name is Elazığ. And it's a sheet of paper with the surah, a verse from the Quran, or a chapter from the Quran, the Yasin Surah. It's one of the most enigmatic surahs from what I've read about the Quran. That's what the experts say anyway. I'm not an expert on Islamic theology. So it's that surah of Arabic words, obviously, coming from the Quran, in Armenian handwriting. And it dates to the early 1920s, 1921, 22, when he converted to Islam, and he used that to recite the surah for his conversion ceremony. And it's a testimonial of, you name it, survival, conversion, forcible conversion, continuation of genocide by other means. The registry to check on your ancestry is now open in Turkey, so anyone can go and check their ancestry to see if they are of Armenian origin, Jewish origin, Greek origin, or whatever origin. That was kind of a secret until Erdogan opened up the archives. I suspect they probably keep a tally of how many people are of Armenian descent. But there is a further complication, which is the following. There are lots of people in Turkey, and I did this randomly in Constantinople, in Bolis, while walking in the street, to get a sense. I would stop people on false pretexts, like looking for a street or a restaurant or a church or something, or a museum. And I would try to engage into a conversation. Most people in Turkey are very friendly, very hospitable. especially with foreigners. And they'll be very keen to speak with you, to learn more about you. They are extremely hospitable and very helpful. And I would try to take advantage of that, to ask them, hey, look, you look a bit Armenian too. Oh, my grandmother was Armenian. Why do you say that? Oh, because your eyes or your nose. That's a lie, right? It's a white lie. But to get a sense. So, to put it roughly, I did this for, I don't know, a few days, most for a week, and not the entire day, because, you know, it's going to attract some attention. So, let me put it this way, like, out of 5, 1 or 2 would tell me, yes, my grandmother was Armenian. It's usually grandmother, because the men were exterminated or murdered. How many of these people would you want to call Armenian? Or how fairly can you label them as Armenian? Do they feel Armenian? They might. Or they might feel some sympathy. They may not. They may even not care. Some may even embrace it. But does that make them Armenian? Some perhaps were even hiding it from me, that they did have Armenian ancestors. So you don't know. It comes to a point, like this girl from Malatya I was telling you before, who didn't even know she was of Armenian descent, until, you know, the police showed up at their door to protect them. Touring these towns and villages, and asking idiotic questions like I used to do, like, hi, I'm Avo from New York, I'm looking for Armenians. Oh, he's coming for the gold that the Armenians have buried. So, but, you know, after you weed out the trash answers, which are many in that part of the world, you do find some nuggets of gold. They would tell you, you know, there is an old lady called Navart who lives in Kozluk. So you look it on the map, Kozluk, little place. Oh, okay, so I go to Kozluk, it must be, you know, a one-street village. And you arrive, and, you know, it's a big town. And you arrive in Kozluk, and they said, oh, well, you know, there are like, I don't know, 70,000 people here. Is she from Kozluk proper, or from any of the villages around? And how many villages are there? Dozens. So it's a huge country. It's really very big. It's like, why does he want to meet Armenians? You know, they've been trying to hide it for a century. And it did happen to me once in Dersim. I showed up, and unfortunately this man had just, I mean, a few hours before, I didn't know that, returned from the hospital after a heart attack. He was in his 70s, and he was scared. Why? How did he know I'm Armenian? I don't remember how I found he was Armenian, but it was like in a lost village. It was literally at the end of the road. I took a bus, a minibus, where the road ended. I was dropped there. It was like at the end of the road. And there were like 10 houses, mostly empty, because most people you have this situation in Turkey where most people in the interior migrate to the big cities, and they just leave the small towns, and they only came back for the summer, and it was winter, so there were like 2 or 3 people left in the village. And I asked, hey, there is this guy here who's Armenian. Ah, yes, it's right there. So I went in, and I was like, you know, introducing myself. These are the beginnings of my research, right? So then I got a little more subtle when I was, you know, freaking people out. And a woman opened the door, smiling. And when I asked, hey, I'm Armenian, is your dad Armenian, right? I was like, what? Come in. And she gave me a tea, and then she asked me to leave, basically. I remember her father, like, heaving. He was like, you know, very, very scared, and was like, oh, I'm sorry. No, just finish your tea and then go, and don't come back. So, yeah, so I just had to leave. And he kept asking, how did he find out? In my presence, how did he find out I'm Armenian? He was very scared, and they think, you come from the police or you're a spy, and, it just, you can't blame them given our history in that place. To get a grasp on the elasticity of identity. Identity is not a static quality. We have several layers of identity. We may obviously choose one over the other, or we may end up having one, even if we didn't choose that one. I am not sure I chose to be an Italian Armenian. I love Italy. That's a reason I live there. I married an Italian woman. But I still find it strange after 8 years to heard myself described as an Italian Armenian or as an Argentine Armenian, which is, closer to truth maybe, or as an American Armenian, even though I was one. I am one. I'm an American citizen, but I no longer live in America. But I was born in Aleppo. So at the airport, what they say, and they never fail to see that at the airport, is that I was born in Syria. So, but I don't speak a word of Arabic. I was 1 year old and a half when I left Syria. So, and I remember Aleppo Armenian friends in New York laughing genuinely and without any malice when I told them, I am Halepci too, I'm an Aleppo Armenian too, and they were laughing. Yeah, I was born in Aleppo, but can I really claim to be an Aleppo Armenian? Well, no, really. So there are so many layers to identity. The way we Armenians relate to our identity is very thickly colored by the genocide. I'm not saying setting foot in Turkey again. I met wonderful Turks, non-Armenian Turks. I met wonderful Kurds. I met wonderful people there. I miss them every day. That land is part of my homeland. I regret it's called Turkey. I detest that it has the history that it does. I find their flag offensive because of the crimes perpetrated under that flag that are still being committed against my people and against so many other nations, including Greece, Cyprus, the Kurds. I don't forgive myself and I don't forget. First reason is because nobody has, apologized for that. And an apology would do nothing at this point. It's too little, too late. And number two is Turkey has remained an unreconstructed, victorious, successful, genocidal nation and state. And I am choosing my words here. I'm fully aware of what I'm saying. Turkey is built on conquest and genocide. The totality of Turkey is land conquered from other people. Turkey is built on pillaged wealth and on the death of the indigenous native nations. It's something they not only boast about, they have been extremely successful with that. And that's why they have no incentive to change. Most of the people I met in Turkey are wonderful people, wonderful. They're among the most wonderful people I've met. And I'm not exaggerating here, I have no reason to do that. I have a very clear position on what I feel for my homeland and for my nation. But I met splendid people in Turkey, most of the time. Their hospitality and the lengths they would go to help an Armenian like myself, sometimes, you know, overwhelmed me, defeated really my power of gratitude. And yet still, when you have a country foundationally built on genocide, that changes a lot of things, because that's the primary source of their power. And that's why, for example, the Turkish state, Turkish governments have difficulties handling what to do with Saint Sophia. So, you know, they convert it into a mosque, then into a museum, then it becomes something else, then it becomes a mosque for a few hours a day. Because they can't really handle who they are. And Erdogan, at least, is now very honest about what they are. They are a nation of genocidal conquerors. That's what they are. And that's why they can't handle that thing sitting in the middle of Constantinople, reminding them of what they are. And I will give you one other example. I won't give you names. I met this wonderful person in Dikranagert, an architect. He's married to a woman of Armenian descent, converted to Islam, but now she's, I think, she was baptized in Armenian again. And this man is a very refined man, a wonderful person, a wonderful person. He's an architect who specializes in reconstruction and renovation of historical buildings, including churches, mosques, and monuments, fortresses, that kind of thing. A very, very well-read person. And a great friend, a wonderful person who gave me, as a Christmas gift, a silver cross. This person, a Turk from Constantinople, who now lives, in Dikranagert, which is something, for the few and brave, being a Turk living in Dikranagert, the city of majority Kurds, it takes guts. And I know what it is, but when you are in Dikranagert, or Diyarbakir as they call it, immediately it's like an animal feeling. You realize who is who, who's a Kurd, who's a Turk. And he stands out, he's red-haired, has these pasha-type mustaches, so just he looks like, a sultan. Very nice guy. he's so nice and so brave that, not being an Armenian, he would attend the commemorations in the Kranagert that until a few years ago they still did. I don't know now, because I haven't been following. In the memory of Hrant Dink, demanding justice, which is very brave of the Armenians there, but they're Armenian, right? He's not, he shouldn't, but he went there with his wife, holding a sign. And he went to the commemorations of the genocide. So all in all, a great guy, like those people you look forward to having conversation in this reconciliation process. And I am all for it, because I think it's part of the healing. But it's not fundamental, and I will tell you why. So this architect, we were having a conversation. I think it was the first night we met. He was just back from Mardin, where he had restored, I think it was a, if I'm not mistaken, a 13th century mosque. He had restored the minaret of this mosque, and he had discovered during the restoration process that in the balcony of the minaret there were little angels. And he told me, of course, that was done by yours, he told me, by Armenians, by your people. Why? I said, well, they smuggled these angels into a mosque. And it's normal, he said, that you would do that. Because, you know, mosques were built by Armenians and other Christians. Because we, the Turks, were busy defending the borders and conquering lands. And we told the Christians, you go and build our mosques and our homes and our cities. So, even among, I'm not saying every Turk thinks like that. There are other Turks who demand justice for the genocide. I'm not sure about the lands, which is another thorny topic here. But anyway, so this is a guy, a person who unequivocally supports Armenians, who's absolutely friendly, who recognizes genocide, married to an Armenian, wants justice for Hrant Dink, pro-Armenian. But that's the mindset. Of course, that's what the states do in his thinking. They conquer land and they defend these borders by doing warfare. In a country that has been educated like that, not only for 80 years, but for centuries, that's what the states do. That's been foundational. You remember that our claim to these lands is that we are from there, and that we built these cities, and we built our homeland there, we had the states there. Whereas their claim on those lands is that they conquered them. So that's the source of legitimacy for them. And that's never going to change. Unless they renounce being what they are, it's not going to change. And the reason it's not going to change is that if Turkey changes, it stops being what it is. It falls apart the minute it changes. That's why it always reverts to a repressive, genocidal and murderous state, because that's what it is. Remember that when Erdogan came to power, he was very liberal. He took a very friendly approach to Armenians. I was very optimistic. And I did my book in that window of opportunity. I was so worried with this book when I started working on it that I feared that by the time I finish it, it's going to have a ridiculous name, because there's not going to be any more hidden Armenia, no secret nation. Until, you know, I stayed there, I imbibed what Turkey is, their mentality, and even these wonderful people. Don't forget that that's the source of their legitimacy. They conquered these lands, that's what the states do, and you'll have tons of stories like that, even in history books. I was kind of taken hostage by a group of nationalists in the Hamşin area, Grey Wolves. They fortunately called the jandarma, which is the rural police of Turkey, and they kind of saved me. They really, I was alone on a hill, surrounded by these people. Nobody knew where I was anyway, so they could have done anything to me. They were threatening me. And I had a couple of encounters with the police in Dersim, and in a village called Modik in Armenian, Mutki now in Turkish, near Bitlis. Someone got violent with me. He attacked me. He tried to strangle me. In the Black Sea region, he was a room. Rooms are the converted Greeks. He was a little drunk, but Hamşinci friends had a runaway car ready for me, so they separated me and they, you know, just whisked me away into the car and we ran away. On my father's side, my grandfather was from Kilis. An interesting story is that his father, my great-grandfather, was murdered in the massacres of Kilis of, I think it was 1895. He was a dyer, a person who dyed leather goods in Kilis, and he was in the marketplace when a massacre of Armenians started. Usually massacres in the Ottoman Empire against Armenians, and this is also, I believe, mentioned by Raymond Kevorkian in his book. I think for the first time I read it there, actually, in the Armenian Genocide. That's the book's name. Usually started in the marketplace. Massacres. They start massacring the Armenian merchants to loot, right? So they murdered him. I think he was murdered by his own neighbors. In the family lore, he was murdered with an axe. They hit him with an axe on his forehead twice in the shape of a cross because he was Christian, and they threw his body outside the home, family home, at the time when my great-grandmother was having he's their second child, my great uncle Alexander. At the same time, so his body was thrown when his wife was giving birth to his youngest son Alexander, and his last one, as it was. That's the family story. I have no way of proving it. I tried to find their house in Kilis, but it was an impossible and hopeless venture. I still tried. It's a strange story. They ended up in Damascus somehow, which was not a common destination for survivors. They mostly ended up in Aleppo. So I don't know, we don't know how she ended up in Gurun, as I said. It wasn't even Constantinople. We would say, okay, maybe she was, I don't know, a nurse, a missionary who went to Constantinople. We have no idea. And the only reason I know about this is that while I was visiting my grandmother's apartment in 1999 in Yerevan, there were the photos of two elderly people hanging on the wall, and I asked her who they were, and she told me she's my grandmother, Maria, and she was Corsican. I was like, what? And I thought I had misheard. I thought maybe she was saying a town, but no, she insisted she was Corsican, and she said that this Corsican woman, Maria, my great-great-grandmother, missed her language very much, missed her town, her city, her country, her land. It's normal, right? So in Damascus, she would go with my grandmother, and I've heard that this pans out, that church does exist, apparently. There's a Catholic church run by Franciscan fathers in Damascus, and she would go every Sunday with my grandmother to visit these Franciscan Italian fathers to speak Italian, or what my grandmother believes is Italian. Probably she spoke some dialect of Corsican, which is, you know, you can mutually understand. It's a bit more difficult. And this Corsican Maria was deported along with the other Armenians during the genocide. I knew very little about Romanian Armenians. I grew up in Argentina, where there were some Romanian Armenians, very prominent ones. The names that come to mind are Vart Baronian, Seferian, Yesayan too. They were a seminal community for Argentine Armenians. They built a church, which is almost a copy of this one. It's based on the blueprints of this church, actually, from what I know. Yeah, as I said earlier, when I walked into this church in December of 1998, I felt an incredible familiarity, which really felt like somewhere else. And I attributed it to being winter. When I see an Armenian flag and I see an Armenian church, I always get emotional, especially when I'm abroad. So I attributed it to that. There was an Armenian widow there, which was very touching, speaking with her. She had just lost her husband and she'd come to pray for him. She was alone in the church. It was dark, I remember that. But I felt incredible familiarity, which I never understood until I spoke with my good friend, Vartan Matiosian. We were talking about something else, and he said, you know that the Armenian Cathedral of Buenos Aires, St. Gregory the Illuminator, is based on the blueprints of the Bucharest Cathedral. Oh, that's why, I told him. It feels the same. It really feels like a clone. You know, you walked into it and, Jesus, I've been here before. And it was the first time. So the Romanian Armenians, in Argentina and elsewhere, had a reputation for being refined, well-read people, and that was my experience too. That was my experience too in New York too, where there is a sizable Romanian community. Of a later period, the Romanian Armenians of New York are a part of a wave that left Romania in the 60s. I didn't know about this when I first came in 1998. I don't understand Romanian, but if you speak a Latin language, you pick words here and there. And I was watching the news in my hotel, and I saw, I think he was a lawmaker at the time. I see Varujan Voskanyan. I was like, what? And I was like glued to the screen to see if I heard right. And it was Varujan Voskanyan. And I felt so proud. And this is the amazing thing. I was walking, it was winter, there was snow everywhere in Bucharest that day. The first night I arrived in Bucharest, that's something I do. It's not always appreciated by the people who are with me in my trips, but whenever I go, the first place I walk into, if there is one nearby, is McDonald's, because I know what there is, and I'm not picky with the food, but I know, when you walk into McDonald's, you know what they serve more or less everywhere in the world. So it's a safe bet. It was winter, I was hungry, so I walked into McDonald's, and the girl who was serving me at the till was her name was something like Mariana or Natalia Toros, the surname. And she was very friendly, and we started talking, and she asked me where I was from, and I told her I'm Armenian. Oh, I'm Armenian too, she said. Oh, really? And she told me this fascinating story of her grandfather being a Tashnak Tsagan from the Tashnak party, who had been deported to Siberia, trying to remember where he was from. I think this is interesting, he was one of those Armenians who had returned to Armenia in 46, 47. So he must have been one of these Natalia Toroses or Mariana, I don't remember. The surname was Toros, I remember that. Must have been one of those Armenians who had returned to motherland from either Greece or the Middle East, Beirut or Aleppo, had been deported to Siberia for being a Tashnak Tsagan, a nationalist Armenian, and I come from a historically Tashnak Tsagan family too. So I related immediately with her, very warmly, on that cold night in Bucharest. And after Stalin's death, he had returned to Armenia briefly and then had decided to leave for Romania. That's all I knew about this man, this girl's grandfather. But she knew where the church was. And her colleague at McDonald's told me, yeah, well, it's down the avenue. And because I knew, I was looking at the maps, this is before Google Maps anyway, in 98. So, and it was such a joy to see the church, in its splendid majesty that night. I was so happy. It was closed, so I came back later. So anyway, one day I was walking up the street, coming here, obviously, that's what you do when you're an Armenian, you come to the church, right? And I see Varujan Voskanyan coming up the street. And like, Varujan Voskanyan, and he's, who are you? In Armenian. And when I said I was a journalist, he was like, no, just leave me alone. But I insisted so much. I can be a pest sometimes. It's part of the profession, as you know. So he agreed to give me an interview later in the day, and I came to his offices. He was somewhere nearby, I remember. And we sat down for, I think, 2 hours. It was a very good interview. And I wrote a story. It was published in La Nación. I was amazed by the collection you have here. It's mind-boggling what you have. The relics, the church curtains that you have are amazing pieces of work, including the one that shows images or 17 groups of images, a group of 17 images of Saint Gregory's Calvary in Horvirab. That made a huge impression on me. But generally, this museum is amazing. I wished it was better known to diaspora Armenians.